agrarian issues in contemporary India. I think he recently got the Malcolm Adiseshaya Memorial Award for his contributions in the field of agrarian studies and developmental studies. Sir, we would like to thank you so much for agreeing to give this lecture. I also would like to thank Professor B.V. Mohanty, who kindly agreed at a very short notice to be the discussant of the for this today's event. And Professor Mohanty is located at Pondicherry Central University, and one of the his contributions to the issues of agrarian India are very important, especially his work on uh, what is that? I forgot the name. Sorry. uh, Agrarian transformation. He published his edited volume on agrarian transformation, very theoretically, very important work at that time. So thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to be the discussant in this today's evening. And I also thank Professor Debal, sir, for coordinating with our both speakers, and also sir is going to chair the session. I would like to request Professor Debal, sir, to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chandrasekhar, for taking the initiative and organizing this talk. Now, again, on behalf of this RC, welcome our special guest, Professor Jodhka, who does not need any introduction in Indian sociology today, especially his contribution to the agrarian studies. And also Professor B.B. Mohanty, another luminary in the agrarian studies in India, and our co-conveners, Dr. Avinash and Chandrasekhar, who has been very active in reviving this RC15, that is Rural and Agrarian Studies in India. And as we understand that India is undergoing a phenomenal process of agrarian transformation since independence. So it has been a big drama of agrarian transformation. 1950s, the community development program, the land reform program, followed by radical peasant movement in mid-60s. Then we find the emergence of the Green Revolution. Then simultaneously we find that farmers movement that took place in various parts of the country. And there has been enormous intellectual effort to conceptualize this development from varieties of perspectives. Initially, we found the community development perspective, the development with justice. Then we found that land and labor relationship become another important component to look into the agrarian scenario in India. Then we find the modes of production debate that dominated the agrarian scene in 1970s and 80s. It was followed by whole issue of conceptualizing the social movement from the peasant and farmers movement from the perspective of new social movement. A new body of literature emerged in Indian among the Indian academia. Then we found the agrarian question become another question of discussion of the agrarian scenario, putting the whole issue within the context of economic neoliberalism, emergence of populism. And also we find simultaneously the process of transition and growing consumerism across the space. So everything has got its own place to understand and interpretation. And now we are having Professor Jodhka among us, and he will give his talk, and that will be followed by a brief discussion by Professor B.B. Mohanty. Then we will open up for discussion. Yes, Professor Jodhka. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a very pleasant occasion to listen to you. Yes, Professor Jodhka. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sir Debal Singha Roy. I'm obviously honored to be here. Thank you, Professor Mohanty, for being part of this discussion. I think all three of us are now senior enough, and we have been engaged with these questions for a long time. So I don't plan to give a lecture, but I think I'll initiate the discussion, and I think all three of us can speak to each other. That perhaps would be a better idea. I could also ask you some questions. I don't have answers to every question, but anyway, thank you so much for organizing this. And I also agree with Chandrasekhar that it was Professor Maitri Chaudhary, after becoming the president, she took the initiative, and even though she doesn't work in this field, but she realizes the significance of agrarian studies, and it started this kind of process of reviving this RC. And Professor Purendra Prasad and Professor Debal Singha Roy were the first to respond to her request, and actually they are the ones who are in some sense steering this whole new kind of initiative within the Indian Sociological Society, which I think is very, very critical, and it kind of takes us to the literally grounds as the world is changing. Avinash, thank you very much for being there. So, as I said, I will not speak for very long. I'll try to wind it up in around half an hour or so, if not earlier, and then we can have discussion. And I would like to hear from both of you. You can kind of add to what I'm saying, or contradict me, or say other things that you think are more important. So it's not something that is a research question. We are kind of trying to speculate and trying to visualize how does one think of agriculture, an agrarian question or agrarian studies in the coming times. Tomorrow, what would happen? So I think one could begin by asking this question: that is talking about agriculture worthwhile? And this is something that became very, in some sense, the point that was made by Chandrasekhar, the fact that this RC itself was not there any longer. So agriculture was seen, or agrarian studies was seen as a dying subject, and this obviously has many reasons, and one obviously is the common presumption that with globalization, with India also becoming a developed country, agriculture would become very marginal, and we don't need to waste our time, and particularly the younger students are not attracted to doing field work in rural areas, in agriculture. So that is not really something that attracts us. And anyway, unlike 1950s, when people like M.N. Srinivas thought that if you want to know India, you need to go to a village, or later on in 60s and 70s, when economists were talking about mode of production or agrarian change, that was also the starting point for understanding India's development, what kind of changes were taking place. All that is assumed to have happened, right? So now agriculture has come down from, say, 50-60% of India's national economy to merely 12-13% perhaps. And people who are employed in agriculture, their number has also come down. So there's a substantive decline of agriculture in every sense of the term. As an economy, agriculture has declined. As an ideology, as something that people choose as source of their livelihood. I remember when I was kind of a PhD scholar. I was growing up in Northwest India. Farming was the most, what one should say, not exactly always desired, but people who did farming, they were very proud of them. They would not proud of themselves. They would not want their children to kind of take up jobs or start shops or become merchants. They were very proud of themselves, and they thought that this was the most dignified occupation. Not any longer. Their own children, when they got educated, and the post-90s shift towards neoliberal kind of aspirations, neoliberal dreams, in some sense led to this decline of agriculture. And this is also the time when, in some sense, state patronage declines, and agriculture begins to experience crisis after crisis after crisis. And that crisis is reflected in many ways, apart from farmers committing suicide. Also, in some sense, decline of agriculture as a kind of respectable, desirable occupation. One of the problem that I remember, a commission which was set up by Government of India, when they were studying Andhra Pradesh, one of the biggest complaint that farmers made was that if you're a farmer, it's very hard for a farmer man to find a wife, because educated women, and mostly women are educated from agriculturally prosperous families. They don't want to stay in the village. So middle class life, urban life becomes the norm, and in some sense, agriculture begins to experience a significant decline. Even if it survives, and this is kind of again something that is the foundational logic of our discipline of sociology, of social sciences, because all social sciences were born in the 19th century at the moment of, in some sense, Western modernity, when it was trying to realize itself. Sociology also came up as a discipline to study urban industrial societies, and social anthropology, as we know, in 1950s, they began to study villages and peasant societies, not because they were interested in them per se. Most of it was because of the larger project of development, that, these newly independent countries are mostly agrarian societies and we need to do something for the development. So agriculture was, or agrarian question was a question waiting to be solved. And once the question is solved, you don't really have a question any longer. So the idea is that, is there a question? Is there an agrarian question? And if I was to kind of restate it, it comes in various forms. For example, we have 3-4 different disciplines or sub-disciplines which emerge in 1950s. The most prominent of them being peasant studies, peasant studies or sociology of peasantry. It was directly connected with the question of development. If you read people like Robert Redfield, or even before that, when anthropologists are studying agrarian cultures, it was out of this kind of colonial notion of underdevelopment or something which would be called as tradition or backwardness. And it was in that context that peasants were conceptualized as rustic, people living in the past, not people who are looking forward. Famous conceptualization of peasantry by Karl Marx as potatoes in a sack, being incapable of revolution. So peasants have to in some sense disappear, die, wither away, so that category itself has no future, and that category should have no future. It was not only something that would be past, but also that should not survive, because peasant is also known as conservative. Peasant is also known as tradition bound, and very kind of low level of satisfaction. When societies develop, agriculture would also develop, and even peasant agriculture will also decline. We also have rural sociology, which develops in United States, but that again is located in the same kind of evolutionist framework, with a binary of rural and urban at the center stage. And rural is seen as a different kind of culture and society, but the understanding is that eventually rural will also grow up to be urban. And the word grow up is very, very critical here, because rural is also seen as kind of infantile, as simple, as not complex, as undifferentiated, and urban is seen as the modern, as the real modern. So rural is not really, even though rural is seen as sui generis, but it's not seen as something which would always be rural. And it is in this context that I think Friedland had published that article sometime in the early 90s, End of Rural Society and the Future of Rural Sociology. So what should we do? In America, there still are departments of rural sociology. And for them, biggest question was that there is no rural today in America. Even small settlements are called as small towns. They're not called as villages. So when you don't have the rural, what would the rural sociologists do? So at some level, that is also in some sense in the same kind of framework of agrarian rural being a matter of past, or as not having future. And at some level, agrarian also comes back in 1950s because of political revolutions. There were what were called as the peasant revolutions. In Russian Revolution, peasantry played a very important role. But more importantly, it was the Chinese Revolution, which was at some level seen as a peasant revolution, which in some sense contradicted Marx's prediction of peasant being a conservative class. And then in the 1940s, you have these national liberation movement where peasantry participates very actively. And that's how in 1950s, there are two incentives to peasant studies. On the one hand, you have this developmentalist perspective, which comes from United States and, people who are worried about, countries of the developing world turning to socialism. But there is also a kind of revolutionary attraction to the peasantry, as peasantry being something which is a romantic category. So many people from the Western world come to study peasant movements, and peasantry is seen as a very interesting subject. And within Marxist political economy, as Professor Mohanty has written a great deal on that, agriculture was also seen as a major question of capital, and agricultural transformation was seen as something which would help countries to develop and become capitalists, right? Agriculture will produce surplus, and that surplus can then be in some sense, invested in building conditions for development of industrial revolution. So in the process, countries will become developed, but agriculture also will, in some sense, transcend itself. So the question of capital, on which the British Trotskyites still keep arguing whether the question of capital is still there or not. But that's a kind of complicated point, and I don't really agree with most of those arguments, because agriculture is not simply, and has never been simply a matter of development of capitalism. Finally, agriculture has been very, very critical because of the world being divided, and it was always seen as something which is relevant post 1950s, which was relevant for global South. Even today, when agriculture is talked about, very few people would talk about agriculture in America or agriculture in Europe, which is empirically not insignificant. Agriculture continues to be very, very significant in countries of Europe and North America. But they somehow, whenever agriculture is talked about, it is in relation to countries of global South. These are still seen as countries with having large number of population dependent on agriculture. So all these frameworks, whether it is the Marxist framework or the functionalist sociology, which talks about rural sociology, or the peasant studies, which borrows from populism and little bit from Marxism, but also functionalism and development studies, all of them see agrarian in the framework of evolutionary change, that as societies modernize, agriculture in some sense will become insignificant, or at least less significant, and we would not need to spend too much time on it. Some people would also argue that even if it survives, it would no longer be agriculture. For example, this argument about industrial agriculture, that agriculture will also become a kind of automated system where you would have one company owning thousands of acres of land, and they are just using machines to produce, and very small number of people would be working in the fields, which has empirically happened in some parts of the world, but only in some parts of the world. However, if you actually look at the point that I'm trying to suggest again and again, agriculture hasn't gone away, right? Agriculture continues to be a very, very significant reality in the entire world, not only in the global South. And even if you look at agrarian studies today, I think there are many more journals focusing on agrarian question today than they were 30 years back, when agrarian studies were at its peak in 1970s and 1980s. Today you have Journal of Agrarian South, Journal of Peasant Studies revived itself and become, and it's very widely cited, and it's very popular journal. And likewise, you can easily count, even in the English language, half a dozen very good journals. I don't have their names in front of me, but these are journals which are very vibrant and producing a lot of good research. And a very large number of researchers continue to work on agrarian questions. We also saw, I think, the point that Debal was referring to, the major farmers movement in India in 2000, and Professor Mohanty published a special issue of Sociological Bulletin, and many of us have been, in some sense, encouraged to go back to agrarian question and rural question following that, and it showed, raised many questions. I don't want to go into that. But I think if one has to make an argument in favor of agriculture, why does agrarian survive? Very simple reason, that you can survive without a computer, but you can't survive without food, right? Food is something that can be produced only from agrarian process. Even if you're a meat eater, eating meat also requires agrarian process. You have industrial processing, and we still don't have any AI made food. We don't know whether it would happen or not happen. So food is something that each one of us requires several times in a day, whether it is in form of coffee and tea, or all kinds of fancy ice creams and various other kinds of packaged food. But the starting point of it is land. Starting point of it is food, and food is something which is not simply reducible to question of property, to question of employment, to question of profit, to question of capital. I think food has an autonomous cultural value. It has a kind of ontological status. And that's what was coming out repeatedly from the farmers' movement, that we are not ordinary people. We are not your working classes. We are not simply talking about our interests. We are talking about something bigger. So at some level, I think the point that farmers, and this is something that I learned at that time, that agriculture is not simply a sector of economy. Agriculture is not simply a source of livelihood. Agriculture is not simply a matter of contribution to its national income. There is something more in agriculture, and that is kind of ontological, which is kind of the very idea of human beings, our existence, and that's why farmer continues to matter, not only as producer of food, but also as a kind of cultural category which cannot be questioned through any kind of nationalist ideology or anything like that. However, we also have a large variety of disciplines that continue to engage with agriculture, and that is kind of something that we need to take on board if we are talking about agriculture today. Sociology, anthropology, I'll come to this point a little later, but we need to recognize that I already counted various kinds of subdisciplines within the field of sociology and social anthropology, sociology of agriculture, peasant studies, rural sociology, questions of political sociology of agriculture, and various other kinds of development studies. But if you look at disciplinary traditions, there are significantly different disciplinary traditions which continue to research agriculture, and it is reviving everywhere, except perhaps for economics, right? Economics was the subject which studied agriculture most actively in 1950s and 1960s until 1970s. After that, economists in some sense began to withdraw. Sociologists were not really so enthusiastic about doing agrarian studies, as I've argued in that paper which came out in Veena Das' Handbook of Sociology. It was Andre Bete's, in 1980s when or 1970s when he did this work, that agrarian studies in some sense acquired a respectability. And agrarian studies was different from village studies. Village studies did not focus primarily on agriculture. They focused on rural ways of life, which were seen as cultural processes rather than as at some level larger economic, socio-economic, political processes. But besides economists, if you look at historians, they are doing very good work on agriculture. They started working in agriculture, even though initially they focused, mostly Marxist economists, they focused on class question in agriculture, whether it is debate on feudalism in India or later on mode of production debate. But there are also people who are doing histories of agrarian lives. A lot of very good work was done by historians on pre-colonial India. And on the basis of that work, we were able to question many of the assumptions that were popularized by the colonial administrators, which were kind of very Orientalist and very essentialist in their nature, that there was nothing like, Indian village, or even questions that Marx raised that India did not have private property in land. So it was because of the historical work. And I've seen over the past 20 years, 10 years particularly, agriculture in some senses reviving as a subject among historians. Besides historians, obviously anthropologists keep working on some aspect of agrarian question, and we need to at some level learn from all of that. So finally, in next 5-7 minutes, I'll try to argue that how should we engage with agriculture as sociologists, as people who are at some level thinking of being in the field in the coming 30 years, right? We're not talking only about yesterday. So we have young scholars. Why should they do research on agriculture? So how should we think about, as the title suggests, agriculture in the 21st century? What are the emerging issues? How should we frame our questions? What kind of questions that we should raise? So my own argument is that it is not by going back to peasant studies or rural sociology or reviving them that we can move ahead. We can learn quite a lot from them, right? For example, peasant studies raised some very interesting questions about agriculture, about rural households, about subsistence and stuff like that. But they did not really have the challenge of facing its kind of complete disappearance. And they were thinking in terms of rural communities in Central Europe, which were more or less self-sufficient. They were producing for their own consumption through family labor, small plots of land, or even when you talk about feudal society. So that is anyway gone. So we are not talking about peasantry does not exist anywhere in the world today. Even if you are a small cultivator working with your own hands, even if you go to interior Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, there also people are integrated in the larger market because everyone is integrated in consumer economy in one way or the other. So even though you are producing very small amount of food, but that's not enough. You're partly working as a migrant laborer. When you work as a migrant laborer, a member of the family works as migrant laborer, you are also integrated in the global market. Agriculture has always been integrated in the global market. It's not like something that agriculture has never been rural, as I've argued in my book, and I keep saying that this coupling of agriculture and rural is very problematic. And I think we need to separate agriculture from the rural. That's why reviving rural sociology is also not an answer. So rural sociology had this notion of rural being sui generis. So my argument is that cities emerge along with the villages, right? The moment you have settled agriculture, and this is not something that I'm saying for the first time, all ancient historians would say that cities emerge the moment you have settled agriculture. Settled agriculture produces surplus. That surplus can afford to have an elite, and then elite becomes the state. And that state is located in the urban context. And it is from there that regions begin to emerge as a kind of territorial state. And territorial state and agriculture are very closely related. So agriculture was never insulated rural enterprise. Agriculture was always, even in the so-called ancient time, it participated in the regional economy, and much of the value produced in the regional economy came from agriculture. It is only after Industrial Revolution that urban also becomes a site of production of value. Not that earlier production was not happening. Earlier production was also happening, but that was through artisan kind of thing. But then the dominant source of production, dominant source of value was agriculture. So I think we need to revisualize agriculture, not as something which is traditional, which is pre-capitalist. Agriculture is something that has always been a source of value for human life. The moment human life comes into being, the state systems come into being, all the urban centers everywhere in the world, they are capable of becoming urban because agriculture is producing surplus. The global trades begin to happen when Arab traders come to South Asia and collect spices from here, sell them in Europe. This integration it's not something that happens during the colonial period. It goes back to ancient times, and people were kind of exchanging things with each other. India's spices, Chinese tea, and many other commodities that were traveling. So commodity in some sense becomes a norm with capitalism, but they are not completely invented by capitalism. So to begin with, my first point is that we need to look at agriculture as a different kind of process. It's not reducible to peasant cultures. It is not reducible to rural, but it is a kind of much wider economic process which in some sense circulates. So the agrarian question in 21st century in some sense we are at a very opportune moment when we can reframe agriculture in the language of sociology, right? Because the way we have developed sociology as a discipline, classical definition of Anthony Giddens, that sociology is a study of urban industrial societies, and somehow anthropology should study pre-modern rural agrarian societies. I think that binary we need to break away. Because this then produces hegemony of the urban, it produces hegemony of the Western, it produces hegemony of the so-called modern over everything else. So agriculture becomes something which is left behind, and then you have this whole narrative of a new kind of colonialism, where we saw it during the farmers' movement. These urban economists who were sitting on the television channels, they had very little idea about what farmers were talking about. They had very little idea about how agriculture is integrated in the global market, but they had tremendous amount of arrogance and confidence. And the idea was that they know everything about agriculture and they would decide what is good for agriculture. So there is, okay, there might be something wrong with the existing model of agrarian change. We will work out a different model. Who are you to work out different model, right? So this kind of, the dominant common sense in the urban elite is that rural and agrarian is their colony, right? They are the ones who would decide what is good for the rural, what is good for the agrarian. And in order to dispel that, and if we have to have a future of agrarian studies, we need to visualize agrarian, as I have also argued, rural as well, as a process which is creative, which is generative, which is aware of itself, right? And again, if you were to compare the same kind of when farmers movement were happening and we were all sitting, I was all the time glued to television channel or to YouTube channels. When farmers were talking about agriculture, sitting on the borders of Delhi, they were talking like global citizens. They were not talking about just village. They were talking about critically how agriculture is integrated in the global economy and how prices are changing and how these policies, these new laws are going to affect us in a very complicated manner. They had clear understanding of farm laws. So they were knowledgeable agent. They were kind of, what the word I use in 2-3, I think these were cosmopolitan Kisans, right? Kisan was very cosmopolitan and the urban elite was very parochial. Urban elite was only thinking of quote unquote, mostly himself, most of them were men, and they were thinking from a colonial mindset that we know about the rural and therefore we will decide what is good for the rural. So I think if we were to kind of get out of it and look at agriculture as a creative, generative process, like we think of family, like we think of caste, like we think of any other subject, agriculture is also a site which we need to explore. And I was kind of thinking about it for the last 3-4 days. I've been thinking about this presentation. And I was thinking we could think of 3 different sites if we have to have a future of agrarian studies. One is, obviously, we need to study a site of production. Okay, before I do that, let me kind of clarify one more point that I want to make, that as students of sociology, we approach agriculture as a relational process. The moment we use the word relational process, it opens up many questions. That agriculture is not simply a matter of economy, it produces certain structures of relationships. And these structures of relationships then have the possibilities of producing inequalities, producing marginalities, producing hope, producing wars, producing all kinds of, other bondings and stuff like that. So those relational processes can be studied at 3 levels, or there could be 3 sites of those relational processes. One is site of production, and this is where the old agrarian studies was focused on, that how are relational structures around agricultural production formed and how do they reproduce themselves. So you would talk about class, agrarian classes, landless labor, tenancy, and stuff like that. So there is a site of production around which the Marxists talked a lot about it, class relations and stuff like that. So agriculture definitely continues to be a site of production. But as site of production, it is not simply a matter of class of landed farmers and landless laborers or landlords and tenants. No, site of production is also very complicated. It is integrated in various other ways through to the larger processes of global capitalism, right? Whether it is through fertilizers and pesticides or through, in some sense, global markets, what is sold and what is bought. This is not something which happens for the first time. It again goes back to the production of spices in Kerala, where this production was for market. So the related relational process is what I was just talking about, site of exchange. Right? Site of production would be going to the farm and looking at farming as a relational process. Site of exchange has also always been very central to agriculture, as I said. There's nothing new about it, but somehow site of exchange has never been taken seriously. It's only when people like Sharad Joshi started talking about unequal exchange that site of exchange began to be talked about. What were farmers protesting? They were protesting because they wanted to have some say in mechanisms of exchange, that what they produce on their farms has to be sold in the market. They need credit. They have to borrow from the market. They need inputs which they have to borrow from the market. So agriculture is integrated in the global market, and the patterns of this integration have changed over a period of time. And now, obviously, those patterns have become much more global, right? You go out here, I'm sitting here, after I go 2 kilometers from here, I can get oranges and apples and cherries and all kinds of fruits. And they would tell me, that even in small seller would tell me that this apple is from New Zealand, this is from Turkey, this one has come from Washington, this one has come from Afghanistan, this cherries come from there, and you have various kind of price ranges. So you need to just have a consumer, and then you have this. So, and likewise, you have basmati rice available, you have Thai rice available in a supermarket in Los Angeles or in Bangkok. So you'll have variety of rices available wherever you go. So this is a structure of food consumption, food markets, which needs to be visualized sociologically. Because when I'm saying as a relational process, it involves lots of intermediaries. So between the producer and the final consumer, there are lots of intermediaries. And these intermediaries are not simply random individuals. These intermediaries are also structures. They are social structures of capital, of lobbies, of nation states, of global patterns of distribution. So these are large kinds of relational processes which determine how much will reach the actual producer. As I said, relational processes produce inequalities. Relational patterns produce structures of relationships. It would also involve question of gender, at some level also questions of nationality, race, caste, etc., etc. At different levels, one can work that out. Finally, the third site where I think agrarian studies need to focus is the site of consumption. And consumption I was mentioning earlier also, but here I'm talking about food, which we were discussing earlier, that food is an ontological process, right? Food is not something that we can do without. But food is also a social process. Food is also a politico-economic process. Food is also a cultural process. Food is also a gender process. Food is also a class process. Food is also a caste process, right? We know about how food becomes a caste process in India, how food becomes a reality of gender and class in India, how food becomes a source through which inequality between men and women are produced. If we were to just expand a little bit our imagination, sociological imagination around food, you could raise hundreds of questions. And these are not simply questions of the way anthropologists talk about sociology of food. If we talk also about the value of food and how it is structuring relations between the actual producer, someone who actually produces apples, and someone who actually consumes apple. I mean, these days, you get apples in Delhi and they have these small labels written. On label is written Adani, right? Whose apple are you eating? It's Adani doesn't produce apple. And how apple processing has become very different. I mean, earlier apple came in a season and then they would get spoiled. And now I've seen even Indian apples, they are there even 3 months, 4 months after the season is over, and they're very hard. They're not tasty, but they are not spoiled. So what are they doing? They're obviously plucking them earlier or whatever. So there is a process that is involved, right? So storage, the whole chain of food. So food is part of agrarian. And I think if we were to kind of think of these 3 sites of production, site of exchange, site of consumption, as relational processes, as processes that structure and reproduce human relationships and human identities, identities are also related to this, in different ways. One can talk about, artiyas, one can talk about different kind of intermediaries. We were talking about gender, and in Indian context, caste, and what food, who is going to eat, is also in some sense very closely related to it. Identity of being farmer, identity of being tenant, identity of being a bonded laborer. All these things are also very crucial to this. And finally, which is something which has come up very significantly, not very recently. It's been around, but it has acquired a significance, and that is the broad framework of ecology and development. And these are questions which obviously are relevant to everything, but they are perhaps much more relevant to agriculture than they are relevant to anything else. I mean, they perhaps are more relevant to industrial reality, but agriculture is also an ecological process, because food is consumed by human body, and all of us are now eating poison every day. And, lots of people will tell you, and there is empirical work available, the amount of pesticides that are there in our food, the amount of the kind of fertilizers that we are using, what implications it will have for human race in the long run, right? So ecological processes are very central, and which were not really talked about when we were studying about green revolution. Nobody bothered about ecological processes. Likewise, question of development. We talk about development as an outdated category, but development is still very central to common people, because development also means entitlements, right? So when we think about development, I think if one was to think of development today, we need to, in some sense, invoke the idea of state. The state has important responsibility, and that's what farmers were saying, that state can't run away. We can't be handed over to corporates, and those corporates will then decide, how agriculture should produce, and how agriculture should exchange, and how agriculture should consume or should be consumed. So I think development continues to be a very significant process, and where state and states' responsibilities of making all these things possible and making agrarian processes fair, so that it doesn't produce major marginalities. And if suicides are happening in a society, I don't think that can be considered a good society or happy society. I think I've spoken longer than I had expected to, but I think I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Jodhka, for making such a serious, simple, and engaging kind of a discussion in lecture today. And we have started with the very essence of requirement of agriculture for human survival, number one. Number two, despite the fact that agriculture industry is developing, service sector is developing, but till now the 48% of our workforce is also engaged in agriculture. We have to keep in mind. And also simultaneously, more than 60% of our population living in the rural areas. That is also another, that is the sector area, the last opportunity to fall back in case of eventuality. We have seen that during the time of COVID, how the people are living from the urban to the rural areas. So this is a last place to look into. Then also you have gone a huge kind of a transformation over a period of time, technologically, in terms of usage of land, or also in terms of engagement of the intellectual, the economist, the politician, the sociologist, historian, the way they have engaged themselves. And you have widely talked about how it can be a site of three kind of engagement. That is a site of production, site of exchange, and site of consumption. I'll stop here. Now I'll invite Professor B.B. Mohanty to make his observation and initiate the process of discussion. Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Professor Debal Singha Roy. First of all, I am thankful to Professor Moitri Chaudhary for taking all the initiative to revive this RC15, which was now it is good that it is revived. It was once upon a time a core area of sociology, and now we are reviving this RC, and all of us, we are part of this RC now. It's a very good thing. And it was really a pleasure to listening to Professor Jodhka as always. And it's a kind of difficult thing to be a discussant. It's a very challenging thing. I don't know what to actually speak. But after listening to him, I got this kind of idea that he has provided a kind of very comprehensive view, beginning with his concern for the decline of scholarship in sociology and anthropology in agrarian studies, and how agriculture also lost its importance, social and economic importance in due course of time. And then also the important point also he made regarding the various disciplinary traditions, and tried to explain the trajectory of agrarian studies at the global level and in India also. Then the last point which he made, which is very significant, regarding the agriculture is a kind of different kind of economic process. It is the creative and generative process, and moreover, it's a kind of relational process. And where he is talking that it has the agriculture has 5 different sides. He identified that: production, exchange, consumption, and ecology. So actually, it's really, I don't have any disagreement with him, and really I agree with him. And these are the important points we have to keep in mind. The point actually I want to add that one thing he said, that agriculture is not a matter of development of capitalism. But that point I think I don't agree entirely, because that is actually the foundational kind of thing for development of agrarian studies. If you see the agrarian, the analysis of the classical agrarian question, and also subsequent the mode of production debate in India, and also the anthropological studies, some of the studies made by Eric Wolf and Sidney Minch and others, they were talking about the capitalism and development of capitalism, and that is the kind of central point. And when we are trying to expand it further, we cannot keep aside this point. That is the point I wanted to tell you. And the biggest kind of problem now we are facing, now the kind of changes we have experienced in 21st century, it is unprecedented, and it was actually not experienced earlier in terms of scale and relations of production, which has actually opened up many kind of new questions. And we have actually the process of depeasantization as well as repeasantization, and we have kind of a de-agrarianization, again also re-agrarianization. The labor has become more mobile, diverse kind of directions and multiple directions of migration. And we have also at the same time there are also new kind of rural protests are coming up across the globe, not only in India and other parts of the globe, in Latin America, in Africa, in parts of Asia. We have this kind of thing. And we have new kind of gender issues are also coming up relating to land rights, and these are the things. The point is that how to theorize this complex change. It's the major concern now, how to theorize these complex kind of things. Now, as Professor Jodhka told, that Marxian political economy, that was the kind of major paradigm which was used to understand this agrarian change. And almost all the agrarian studies, major part of the literature followed that paradigm. And that was a kind of, now I don't know how far it is relevant, but that those orthodox kind of paradigm, that also is being questioned by some of the Marxist followers themselves. They have also questioned, of late, now there is a kind of new development, the critical agrarian studies, which are critical of the classical Marxist approach, critical of the political economy approach. They are saying that it's the critical agrarian studies is a new dimension, a new development. But that also is not free from this Marxist analysis. That is not also free from the class-centric analysis. So point actually how to, in the case of Indian, the societies like India, where actually we have a kind of complex situation. And this kind of paradigm, whether it is essential, useful for our purpose, because most of these approaches actually they are Eurocentric and economistic also in explanation. They are mostly following the economic kind of criteria to analyze these things. So how far we can comprehend kind of a new theories or new kind of approaches to understand this process. I understand that production, distribution, exchange, all these things are addressed. All these things have also dealt by the earlier studies. But now these are kind of different kind of scenario now. Now the production, consumption, and the relationship between producer and consumers and relationship between consumption and production, it has acquired a kind of new dimension, and it was not there earlier. So we need a kind of different lens. We need a different lens, but how to conceptualize, how to theorize this thing, that is a kind of major challenge we are facing, particularly in the context of India. And the second thing I want to add, that the conceptual categories which we are actually employed earlier, now I agree with Professor Jodhka that agriculture and rural, that need to be redefined. That need to be redefined, and we have to reconceptualize that. The earlier understanding of agriculture, rural and agriculture, the kind of correspondence that is no more there. And we have to see the categories of analysis like land and labor, how far they are sufficient or adequate to capture these kind of inequalities or the differentiation or the kind of the kind of peasant politics which is taking place, that we want to see. The very concept of peasant, the earlier the lot of long discourse was there on peasants, how to define peasant, but we need to actually see this concept in a kind of different lens, and also that the concept, what was the elements of this that identifying peasants, that is no longer valid. But peasant as a kind of category, it exists, it continues to exist. Peasant as a category, what Professor Jodhka said, that agriculture is existing, agriculture will continue to be a kind of living reality, and small scale producers are there, and they have a kind of peasant-like characteristics, though they are no longer the peasants of the earlier kind of time, but they have the characteristics of peasants. So that is actually using that as a kind of concept. Many of these scholars, they argue that classical agrarian questions are resolved, that peasants, they are no longer peasants, they are the petty commodity producers. Varanstein is saying that they are petty commodity producers, but that is, we do not agree with that actually. That need to be questioned. Agrarian questions are not resolved, and particularly in the case of India, they are the scholars led by Varanstein, they argue that agrarian questions are resolved across the globe. But in global south, it is not resolved. Other scholars like Mao and others, they argue that it is not resolved, it continues to be relevant. But yet another group of scholars, they argue that not only those agrarian questions, but they added also new set of agrarian questions relating to food sovereignty and food security, future of farming, livelihood, those kind of things, and gender issues they have added. The point is that these agrarian questions, they are valid, and some more questions are there, and particularly in the context of India, which have a kind of contrary responses from different categories of people to globalization and to economic reforms. We have a different kind of experiences. We need a kind of regional approach here. We need a kind of regional approach here, because different regions are experiencing different kind of changes, and the categories of population also, they are different categories of population, they are also response is different. So the boundary between nature and culture is to be redrawn actually. That is the point actually I want to make. The boundary between culture and nature, that is need to be redrawn, because the agriculture has also gone a kind of tremendous change. The process of agriculture has gone kind of tremendous change. And in the rural areas, actually the farmers, they don't consider agriculture as the only source of income. They consider actually as a kind, it is a kind of one of the sources of income. There is a kind of increase in pluri activity. Lot of other kind of farming as well as non-farming is coming up. So it's a very complex kind of picture. So we need a kind of different kind of theoretical and conceptual lenses to view these changes and to articulate these changes and put forward our arguments. And also another point I want to make, that we also have to generate a scholarship which will be engaging with the global studies or global debates. We cannot leave aside global debates, because agrarian studies, though it is actually not attracting much attention in India, but at a global level, there are some exciting debates still going on in the pages of Journal of Peasant Studies, Agrarian Science, and Rural Studies. In many other kind of journals, it is going on. So in India, we have, as Professor Jodhka pointed out, that there is a kind of decline of scholarship which was there earlier. It is not there. We have to generate also scholarship. There is a kind of people are actually, scholars are thirsting for sociological inputs, anthropological inputs on peasants, on farmers, but it is missing actually in our case. Agriculture in India, it is not like the case what it is there in Europe or America. We have actually still a large majority of the people, they are dependent on agriculture. Their livelihood is revolving around agriculture. Though agriculture has declined or experienced some decline in other kind of economic return or social kind of importance, but still it is a kind of living reality. I agree with that. But we have to engage with the global debates, and global debates largely surround around these that kind of questions, like the future of farming, or the de-agrarianization and agrarianization, survival and persistence of peasantry. Those kind of things are there. Though how far they are valid, or how far they are important in India, that we have to see and we have to engage with them. I know they are more on economics line, and we have to have a kind of sociological lens to contribute insights for better understanding of this. And India is a kind of a different example, and we need not follow them in toto. Actually, we can offer something new to them that will be helpful to understand India as well as to understand the global scenario. So that for the 21st century, we have actually some concerns and some kind of challenges. But as pointed out by Professor Jodhka, that we need a kind of the language of sociology to understand the agrarian realities, and we engage with the global studies. So I think I will stop here. If there are some other further discussion, I will be happy to participate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mohanty, for making a very elaborate kind of presentation on the talk given by Professor Jodhka. We do understand that notwithstanding the industrial development of huge kind of machineries, notwithstanding the emergence of a ICT-driven society, we can understand that people can't survive by eating machine and by eating information. They need food ultimately. As long as Professor Jodhka told, there is a need of food, and there will be the need of food in this earth. Peasant society, farmer society, and the agrarian society will continue to exist on this earth. Now, may I request Professor Jodhka make some quick comments on Professor Mohanty's observation. Yeah. Then we will open up for the.
Thank you very much, Professor Mohanty. I think those comments are well taken. I'm not really, but that's just a couple of points. I think, as you were rightly pointing out towards the end, that agrarian studies, most of the theoretical conceptual debates are carried out by a small group of Marxist scholars in Western Europe, right? Some of them are now shifted to America, and they remain kind of bringing in the question of class and capital, right? So obviously you can't talk about anything without talking about capitalism. Capitalism is a very central thing. But the manner in which, for example, agrarian studies in India talked about capitalism, whether it is, say, classical agrarian studies or mode of production debate, how can you think about capitalism developing within agriculture? As if, my position is very, what was famously conceptualized by Andre Gunde. Capital markets began to develop in the 15th, 16th century. The moment you have this new kind of process, capitalism develops simultaneously all over the world. And agriculture gets integrated into capitalism from day one. The moment, say, for example, colonial circuit is introduced, we are all the time, people are trapped in capital. Accumulation is happening at one place, pauperization is happening at another place. While Indian Marxists were saying that, in India, what was happening is semi-feudalization. I don't accept that language, because you can't really conceptualize agriculture as a sector. So agriculture sector then becomes, which agriculture sector? Bihar, rural area. Within Bihar also there would be 5 different regions. Or you're talking about Punjab, or you're talking about Kerala. Every region is different. The fact is that all these regions were eventually integrated in the global market. And unless you look at the larger global process, that's why I started talking about the word relational process. Relational process will actually be process of capital. But the process of capital translates also itself through existing structures and identities. When I was working on this paper on which Chandrasekhar mentioned, colonial caste, agrarian studies and caste conundrum, I looked at entire set of agrarian studies. People who say that we want to work on caste, they'll talk about caste in their preface and in one para, then they go back to class, right? They'll want to talk about identities, then they go back to the same thing because that is familiar. Or critical agrarian studies, as you rightly said, they eventually go back to the class framework, right? So they recognize that agriculture is surviving. The very idea of surviving assumes that it should die, or it ought to have died, but it has not died. So I think we need to come up, I think Marxism is also embedded in the same modernist teleology. That is my argument. Unless we question that, not that we can't have a Marxist critical perspective, we should have. But the existing Marxist debates on agrarian question, all the Trotskyites, and they would not listen to me. They don't take us seriously at all. They're so arrogant. And I've seen them, I've met them. They don't even want to talk to you, right? And you would have also encountered them. So there is a kind of racism which operates on the name of being Western scholars, and they have read all the classical literature. So that's where my argument is that yes, we should engage with them, but we should engage with them like they engage with us with our language, right? I think, as you rightly said, Indian situation is far more complex. And if we were to engage with our empirical and produce a language using our training in social sciences, in the global social sciences, and using a new language, with that language, you go and study the Western societies. We can't do it because the world is structured in an unequal manner, but we don't need to look up to them for recognition, because that is what has been happening. So a lot of so-called critical scholarship has been part of the white imperialist project. It has also been a racist project, right? You talk to black scholars, they have similar kind of experiences, right? That's why if you read some of the material in Agrarian South, they talk about it, this class question, as if we are incapable of studying our cultures, as if we are incapable of looking at our realities. They would just say that, yeah, we're being populists. I had that debate with Tom Brass. It was so arrogant. I mean, he would not accept the fact that I have empirical, data. I can't collect empirical data unless I'm a Marxist of his kind. Otherwise, I'm a nationalist. So they always keep giving you labels, and all of them. I've interacted with many of them. So that's why, beyond a point, one should not take them very seriously. And one should be able to kind of show them mirror that you talk about criticality, you talk about, revolution, but you are yourself located in the West, and they don't realize that their location also is location, right? They think we are located in the third world, and they are universal because they use this Marxist language. It's not like, so there are obviously very, very rich contributions that they have made, but because of their richness, they have also acquired a different kind of arrogance. And I think that's what makes it, redundant. Who cares, right? So that is why agrarian studies also became irrelevant. Petty commodity producer, what does it mean, right? As if people were not earlier producers. So when farmers were in peasants were producing cotton in the 17th, 18th century, was that not petty commodity that was also being sold through some kind of circuits? And you call them semi-feudal, but at the end of the day, the cotton was reaching Manchester, and we were getting our dresses. So, or spice production in Kerala, how would you conceptualize it? Right? That was happening in 5th, 6th century. Arab traders were taking spices all over the world, or the tea production in China. So I think we need to reframe agriculture not as a sector of economy. There is also a kind of ontological fact about agriculture, which is food and working with nature, which is very different from working in mining, right? So agriculture, that's why agriculture also produces folklore. And so I completely agree with you, but question of race, caste, gender, they eventually reduce it to class. So they would, the best they can do is they would come to this category called co-constitution of class and caste, co-constitution of class and gender. It's not co-constitution. Gender processes are very different, culturally very different, historically very different, politically very different. Their consequences are not reducible to class. So I think I completely agree with you on all the points that we need to engage with the world. But my only thing is that we need to engage with the world with our own feet on ground. And with those feet, we also need to develop a language. And then that language doesn't need to come from, a conference room sitting in LSE or SOAS or wherever. It needs to come from the fields. And this is again something that has come up from the ground and from the listeners also. What is the alternative, right? That's why I was saying, let's not assume that village and agriculture is our colony. They are thinking about third world still is our colony in terms of knowledge production. They know how we should conceptualize our realities, right? Not that they have no right to know, they have right to know, and we should engage with them. And they are as much embedded, sometimes much better scholars. We have learned a lot from them. But there is this east-west distance continues. So that was the only thing I was. So I don't think we again, this also answers your point about regional approach. I think there are no regions as far as, yes, empirically there are regions, right? We obviously have to locate us in specific contexts. But conceptually, we have to also say that what I see in my region, one can also see caste and race and agrarian production in the West. See, the race process is a very central. Say, for example, we were talking about small producers in say, France or in Netherlands. All of them would be local whites. There would be very few blacks or Asians who would be there. So I think there's very close connection with, or there is a kind of pattern in migrations and agriculture in different parts of the world. Or say, for example, in Italy, where our Punjabis are going and settling down in agricultural sector, that itself is a very interesting process, right? The whole, dairy industry is given to Punjabis, and that in some sense is also a very agrarian process.
Thank you, Professor Jodhka. Now, just a little at this point, my small intervention before I open it to this. Now, we find a diverse kind of a perspective, a Western perspective to look into through their own lens and own windows, we can say. But we are having certain perspective from within, that is, you are talking about looking the peasants as a cultural category, looking from the cultural perspective. Are you subscribing to this fact that there is a need to indigenize the agrarian studies in Indian context? If it is not a process of indigenization, what kind of intersectionality with various theoretical positions you are visualizing?
I don't like the word indigeneity at all, right? You can't do social sciences by being indigenous.
Yeah.
Social sciences by definition have to be comparative, have to be global, right? Yeah. Indigenization can happen in music and in food and dance, but not in social sciences, right? So when I'm saying that, I'm saying food is also a cultural process. I'm not talking about peasants. I'm not using the word peasant at all. For me, peasant, again, one can use the word peasant in two different manners. One is the classical notion of peasant society, which you find in people like Shedin and Robert Redfield. That kind of category, even at that time, was a misnomer, right? For example, India was always a differentiated rural. It wasn't a peasant society ever, right? We had Kisan, which can be translated as peasant, but Kisan was also a caste group invariably, right? And there were also people who were big landowners, Malik Mazdoor Kisan, like Thorner rightly pointed out. So we did not have that kind of peasant society which the Central Europe had, which Marx is referring to. But we also use the word peasant in a generic sense in which perhaps you are using. So I'm not saying that peasant is a cultural category or agriculture is a cultural process. When I'm saying that agriculture is a relational process of a very specific kind, where it also becomes ontological in the sense that it is not something that you can ever escape. All of us are linked to agriculture in some way or the other, wherever you are. I don't know how this woman in outer space lives and what kind of food she eats, but at the end of the day, at some level, our biological process and agrarian process, there is a connection. And that connection is not something that we can escape. And that connection also has a very complex relational structure, which is mediated through all kinds of politico-economic processes, right? And this is universal. This is global. This is not unique to India. But every region has its own specificities. Like within Europe also, when you have a country like Netherlands, which has a very large dairy industry, is different from, say, Britain, right? Or Italy, which is migrant population now doing their agriculture, also has an agrarian process, right? So how do we conceptualize all these together? Yeah. They would think of specificities, but eventually, say, for example, in Italy, the way agriculture is integrated in the Italian national market, and from there in the global market, it is also integrated with the Indian labor. Yeah. Labor that goes from here And that labor circulation is not just one-way process. It also then comes back in forms of remittances, in forms of, incentives to travel, or even the very idea of, consuming cheese, right? Middle class formation and middle class tastes. So I think it's a complicated process. I'm trying to argue that we need to go beyond the existing long language and existing boundaries, which have all been drawn by the white man from a kind of, modernist teleological perspective, that eventually all of you would want to be like us. We don't really have the choice. We will never be like them because they colonized us. So they have the privilege of using class framework for themselves and for us because they were colonial powers. So class could emerge and they could forget about race, not any longer. Now race is very central to those societies because that moment of colonialism is partly over, not entirely, right? So I think the world is at a moment where I think we can produce kind of thinking with which we can know the world without reducing it to very kind of old language of cultural determinism or indigeneity. Not at all. I mean, we have to be comparative if we have to be doing social sciences.
Thank you for giving this very broad, explanation. Now, before I open it for questioning from the audience, I'm having only one request. One is that so far you have understood that agrarian studies hold much more promise than it is given to the contemporary scenario. It's an area, it's also a lot of academic promise and promise for research and investigation. So I'll request to all the participants to be the member of our RC15 and also encourage the others to be part of this RC15. I'll also submit your abstract for the forthcoming conference going to take place in the month of December in Gurgaon, that is in Pondicherry University. So keep that thing in mind.